We're starting with our annual G20 address. This shall be chaired by Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who is a former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Government of India. The speaker is Viral Acharya, who is the Deputy Governor at the Reserve Bank of India. And the discussant, we have Chetan Ghate, who is a professor at the Indian Statistical Institute and member of the Monetary Policy Committee, RBI. Can we have all of them on the dais, please?
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Rajat, for inviting me to chair this meeting. I'm going to be very brief. I know people always say that, but then they're not. But this time I really am, because I think both the speakers are extremely well known. I just want to say that I had the pleasure of meeting Viral for the first time when I was very briefly a visiting professor at the NYU, and I used to spend my time urging him that he must get a strong seminar going in NYU on India. So I'm really delighted that, Viral, you did that, but now you come back to the biggest seminar on India, which is India. So welcome, and really great pleasure to be here. He's going to speak, I believe, very broadly on the relationship between the banking and the real economy and its cycles and so on. And then Chetan is going to be a discussant. So with those very brief words, let me ask you, Viral, to go right ahead.
Thank you, Montek. Thank you, everyone, for being here and inviting me to the organizers. As Montek said, I wanted to speak a little more broadly than about things that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis at the Reserve Bank. I think, as Montek said, in fact, prior to starting some seminars on India at NYU, and prior to that, trying to support research on India through some funding from National Stock Exchange, Moody's, ICRIER, etc., all in partnership with NYU when I was there. I think the process started about 5-6 years back. And as I've been in the job for a few months now, and prior to that trying to do research on India, I have felt that we need to see if we can energize more data generation and information analytics on the Indian economy and finance and markets. And I just wanted to pitch a case for that with some ideas. And along the way, actually weave in a research study that I had been doing prior to joining the RBI, and show you some results from that, but also try and explain why I think, in a way, it doesn't quite cut it by modern research standards, and what kind of data and information one would have liked to have in order to take that research study to its meaningful conclusion, so that as Montek said, I'm studying in that research study about transmission from banks to the real economy. I think that's all I've done really for last 15 to 20 years. And that in order to disentangle what I really wanted to study, I simply don't currently have the sort of data one would need. So I think it's a slightly prospective talk in the sense of what I think we should try and move the system, maybe our research system towards. But hopefully it has some good ideas, and maybe in 5-6 years' time or 10 years' time, we can take some steps towards putting some of these things together. So there is some concern out there that there isn't enough discussion or free speech and research and constructive criticism about views on India, etc., or views of researchers, views of policy think tanks, views of policy-making bodies, etc. My sense is that's not quite right. I have felt both from outside as well as having come back to India at RBI that actually a vibrant network is slowly but steadily emerging, both domestically as well as I think globally, that's interested in India. I think it's in the form of university and business school faculty. Then there are analysts at banks, non-bank finance companies, rating agencies, among others. There are researchers at policy institutions and think tanks. I think I learn a lot actually by reading what the media is writing about the economy. Very often they do have probing inquiries and discovery of new facts. And then there are seminars such as this one, conferences, forums, panels. People are getting deputed from universities to policy institutions, vice versa. And there is in general a lot of interest in studying India. My sense is we might be at the point where interest in China was actually picking up globally maybe about 10 or 20 years back. We probably seem to be at such a cusp. One thing that I always keep track of and try to gauge interest from about interest in economics and finance in general is when you get requests from undergraduate and postgraduate students or those who are aspiring to be students, maybe sometimes even their families, asking you the question, should my son or daughter do economics? Should they do finance? And the number of such requests give me a lot of hope that actually this network will only get stronger in due course. I think, I don't want to say we are there. I think we have miles to go before we sleep, to put it poetically. But I think we are on a good, firm trajectory of a lot of open discussion and debate and research on India. And I think that this seems to suggest to me that time may be ripe for us to actually encourage and build a lot of enterprise in economic data generation and information analytics. So what do I have in mind? I think I have in mind that there's a huge opportunity for everyone who's associated with the Indian economy and finance in one way or the other. And in some sense, the way I visualize this is that, okay, we have the actual players who are intricately involved in the economy and finance, so banks and other financial intermediaries who, of course, do get direct access to a lot of the kind of data, activity data that I'm going to talk about. But parallel to them, we need a huge ecosystem of economic and financial data and information services. So just a parallel set of firms who will clearly cut across the banks and financial intermediaries. But this ecosystem, its business should really be something like the following. They should collect, collate, and generate new data points on the economy and financial markets. Some of them may want to disseminate this data publicly. Just today morning, I met a bunch of researchers from NIPFP, and we were talking about new filings that are taking place with the insolvency and bankruptcy code. This data is not yet in machine-readable form. A lot of the data may be directly with the court system through the filings. Very often, PhD students put together these data sets and then they become available to everyone else. So in some cases, data might get disseminated publicly, but in other cases, maybe it's a business, they could sell the data. And then once the data is put together and hopefully it's being used, then it could be analyzed, aggregated, and researched into other forms of sort of second layers of data that can provide further information analytics. So for example, to just take another example here, credit ratings generate first-order ratings data that they produce themselves. But of course, there's data in markets about companies' filings and their risk, etc. And there's so much research that's being done now generating higher-order credit scores of which companies are more likely to default or how many standard deviations of shocks are they away from hitting a default point, etc. These kinds of secondary data are very often extremely useful to businesses, to banks, to corporations in making their business decisions. But I think they could also be tremendously useful to policy making and thinking as well. And I think that given our core human resource strength in computing and IT, and perhaps because maybe the first set of demographic dividends that we had there through sort of labor arbitrage might possibly be getting eroded somewhat, I wonder if the systems and the human capital that we have can actually pick up now a domestic low-hanging fruit, which has not yet been plucked, in my opinion. I don't get as many people writing to me to sell data, frankly. I don't get as many people emailing me saying, oh, we have produced this new analytics. Would you like to take a look at what we've done about the Indian economy? I do get interesting reports. I do get interesting research being sent to me, but not not as much new data, not as much new analytics using that data. So let me first give a set of examples and then lead into the study that I was talking about. Now, one thing I do want to stress before is that I think I have this sort of theorem or a proposition that data that is not being used is unusable. So I think once the data is generated, it's very important to generate analytics with it and immediately make it usable. That's the only way data gets scrubbed, carefully tested for every single data point that's in there to ensure there are no outliers, missing entries, wrong entries, et cetera, et cetera. So here's a few things that I could think of based on the research I've done before and last 3-4 months of actually trying to do real-time policy stuff. So can we generate inflation data on a real-time basis? Can we generate consumption data on a real-time basis? Why might this be important? As you can see, for example, from this year's food inflation dynamics, that there's a lot of stuff happening on the ground that simply statistical modeling of the data is not going to pick up. So how do you get at this data rather than having to wait for it for a whole month or a quarter? This is a bit futuristic, but I could imagine that e-commerce sites, maybe Amazon, once they get big into food, or Big Bazaar, etc., could actually start providing real-time indicators of how food prices are in different parts of the country. They could certainly also start providing information on what is the volume of transactions that's taking place. And then, as I was saying, you could have some both temporal analysis as well as geographic variation in prices and quantities using things like this. So this is something I would love to have access to, maybe with combining several of the e-commerce sites that we have right now. A routine question that gets raised a lot is on employment statistics. We don't measure this very well. And I don't know what's the best way to do it. Survey kind of approach seems a bit tedious. It seems something you can't actually do that well on an ongoing basis, though I'm not sure if that's really true. But there are some clever ideas people seem to be coming up with, at least in the formal sector. Whoever is employed must be receiving a paycheck. If it's a steady job, then that transaction from bank account A to bank account B should show up on a regular basis in payments data. So you could use that actually to track the number of jobs and shifts or those who are losing their jobs. It won't be exact, but it seems like an interesting way of thinking about trying to measure employment. We would have bank and non-bank finance companies now gathering a lot of KYC data that may even be attached to unique IDs. This could be used perhaps through a simple question, an annual question in KYC, and that could be aggregated up to generate some employment statistics. Then, sometimes it's important to know both your formal and informal economy outcomes. Again, a lot of stuff that we analyze is based on the formal sector. So could we use non-bank finance companies and microfinance institutions and maybe collate their data into machine-readable, usable data sets. Maybe some of our national level consumer goods companies could also actually provide interesting data on this front. And then we could ask questions of the sort that people have raised recently, which is, do omissions of rural and informal economy, informal statistics, mask some important economic outcomes based on our formal statistics? State finances seem a very important thing to understand better, but other than the report that RBI puts out, which really scrubs through each individual state's finances carefully, I don't see a lot being discussed and written. One thing that internally we've been thinking about is can we construct like an implied credit rating or risk for our states? What's the implied subsidy in their borrowing costs, given that they all borrow at roughly the same cost in the market, regardless of their health? Switching to maybe more financy themes, I think hot money flows seem something that our economy has witnessed in both directions on an ongoing basis since 1991. We need all kinds of data to even construct an aggregate index of this. They could be coming in through corporate bonds, commercial paper, external commercial borrowings, rupee-denominated bonds or masala bonds. It'd be nice to know what's the source of these investments and their maturity. And then we could go back and study past episodes like the taper tantrum, which is what component of foreign capital that comes into the country is really hot money that's responding heavily to a carry trade incentive, and therefore, when foreign interest rates rise, they just pull the plug and exit. And what part of it is probably more information-based, long-term bets on the country, which doesn't exit as quickly. So right now, we use some judgment on these things while designing macroprudential restrictions, but it would be very nice to actually have data to study and research these things. One thing that bothered me a lot when I was on the SEBI International Advisory Board for a few years was, do we need to have a separate new governance and corporate finance or even disclosure norms for our pyramids and group companies? Can someone actually consolidate the individual company and subsidiary filings to help us understand related party transactions? Are these related party transactions tunneling of some sort, maybe shifting resources out of the country to ring fence them away from creditors? Or is this really just internal capital markets when they are not getting financing from banks and other institutions? And as I said, the thing that's very close to my heart is to understand better bank lending boom and bust cycles. And what I'll do is I'll illustrate it through an example of what one can do with data that is currently available for India, and then expose the limitations of what I have done, and then think about what sort of data might have made this actually a better piece of inquiry. So this was a paper that's not even public yet, but I have been presenting it at a few places. I had given it on August 3rd at a conference that we had organized jointly between NYU and Moody's ICRIER. It was joint work with Prachi Mishra, who's no longer at RBI, but was in the Strategic Research Unit, and N.R. Prabhala, who's also not at CAFRAL, he's back at University of Maryland. So none of the three authors here are where they are stated to be in August 16. I should clarify that whatever I say in this research is just my own views. They don't reflect the official viewpoint of RBI. So the question is very standard. It's almost become like the question in banking transmission I would say, the modern finance banking research in the last 25, 30 years, which is it the banks that's causing the slowdown, or is it really that the economy is slowing down anyways, and therefore banks have the problems that they have? This is sort of almost like the holy grail of all banking research in one way or the other when it connects to macroeconomy. So what we did is we tried to analyze the economic and financial cycle that is still, I think, playing out, unfortunately, for our economy, and it started in 2008. The cycle is very big, and it's rather sharp. And it's almost in contrast to a boom and bust, the kind of notion that it conveys to you when one sees the word boom and bust. Unfortunately, we had a very short boom and a very protracted bust, it seems. So it's kind of a little different than a boom and bust in that sense. But usually researchers try to ask the following question, which is it the bank lending channel that's causing this bust to be protracted? Is the supply of credit too low? Or is it that, the corporates are just stressed? Because they were stressed, the banks made losses. The banks might be willing to lend, but there is so much indebtedness on the balance sheets of corporates, and the sectors they are in have so much excess capacity, lack of pricing power, lack of profitability, that there's actually no demand in the first place. And it's not really the stress of the banks per se that's the real problem. And why is it important? I think it's important because I do think that these kinds of boom and bust cycles, it's good to diagnose them right so that one actually can find the right solutions. One can actually tackle the wound rather than sort of broadly just treat the body as a whole. So the investment picked up very dramatically after the global financial crisis, but as I said, that period was very short-lived, and it started slowing down starting 11, 12. One observes a very similar cycle for other real outcomes besides investment. So if you looked at sales or employment, one observes very similar outcomes. And what makes the research hard is that bank credit, of course, tracks this investment cycle almost one for one. Okay? So it's not that there is some variation in the bank credit cycle that can help you isolate that, oh, there was some quarters when bank credit wasn't doing as much as the investment cycle, and now you can say the investment cycle was as strong, but bank credit cycle had some seeds of its own, and let's try and track now, either exploiting some bank level or temporal variation, how that difference in the bank credit cycle affected the investment cycle. So not surprising, but the credit and real cycles, I'll show you, were extremely highly correlated. So I'll try and keep it simple just through a few graphs and maybe just show one equation to show you how we do one counterfactual exercise based on the results that we have. So on the left-hand side, you have employment growth and sales growth. I think I probably forgot to show you the data, but that's okay. The blue line is the employment growth, the orange line is the sales growth, and that pickup from 2009 to 2011 is the short boom, and then you have a protracted bust in this cycle. You can see that it's very dramatic, actually. The pickup from 9 to 11 is almost too good in some sense. You can then look at the capital expenditures of firms on the right-hand side. These are at phenomenally high levels in the 2008. Even 8 is very high, but and then you can see from 10, 11, it's declining fairly steadily to more modest levels. But higher than 20% capex is on your assets is a very huge quantity of capital expenditure. This is the growth in credit. I have separated it for state-owned and private banks. You can see that the private banks actually had a credit contraction in 2008, right after the crisis. They rebounded and they have remained slightly higher. I'm not showing you numbers beyond 14 because then it's just too far after this episode. But of course, if you plotted this out further, the private credit is very robust, whereas the public sector bank credit has virtually collapsed. In the last year, close to 100% of new credit within scheduled commercial banks is actually from private banks. And then there is this, of course, the interesting part that we are dealing with right now, which is that this has unfortunately ended in that protracted bust phase with remarkably high levels of stress on bank balance sheets. The blue line is the non-performing assets. I've never liked that as a measure of stress because it is something that banks recognize themselves. Banks had found many ways of not recognizing a number of assets as stressed. So if you look at the line above, which is the restructured assets, which basically allowed banks to say we are restructuring these assets, and then they were able to not recognize them as NPAs for a while. But once the asset quality review of the RBI started and got these assets to be recognized as NPAs, you can see that, of course, the two lines flip. The restructured assets come down because they are migrating to the blue line, which is the non-performing assets line. And you can see that the stress level on the aggregate basis is very high, on the order of 7.5 to 8%. These numbers don't include the last year, after which the numbers are even substantially much higher than this. So if you plot the two cycles together, if you look at credit growth and investment growth, you can see that there is a very high correlation between these cycles. The credit growth more or less mirrors, at least as a pattern, the investment cycle that took hold over this period. And so the question that we wanted to ask was, can we disentangle the bank lending channel, which is if banks have stopped lending in this second phase when the credit ultimately starts contracting, how much of that is contributing to the slowdown in the economy versus how much of it is just purely due to the stress of the corporates themselves, because they had heavily borrowed in the period leading up to it, as the credit graph shows itself. And I think this is important for policy because it says, should you focus on resolving bank stress, which would say it's good enough to just recapitalize your banks? Or should you resolve the corporate stress itself, which is the condition of the indebted corporations? Or is it that both effects are at play in data in reasonable magnitudes so that you actually need to address both of these problems when you try to tackle the slowdown that might be happening through these two twin debt overhang problems? So a simple strategy, it's not the state of the art given the lack of the data that I'll allude to later, but sort of one strategy is to do the following. It's a simple differences in differences kind of method that economics and econometrics tries to employ. And so we identify weak firms and healthy firms. I'll be more precise about that. We identify weak banks and healthy banks. And the good news is that you don't have a perfect sorting between the two, which is that it's not the case that weak banks have only lent to weak firms or that healthy banks have only lent to healthy firms. So you have some cross-matching between these categories as well. And then you can ask the question, which is weak performance only at weak firms, or is it also at healthy firms that are connected to weak banks? And I think that's the way we are going to try and isolate a bank channel from just a pure corporate channel. So we'll use the variation pre and post 2012 when the cycle turned. We'll do this four-way matching, which is weak firms to weak banks, weak firms to healthy banks, and then the flip side of that, in order to distinguish the bank lending channel from the corporate channel. Okay, so given that this talk is on data, let me just spend a little bit of time on what the data are. So the data is the CMI Pravis data at the corporate finance level. We analyze about 3,000 listed companies. So having the corporate balance sheets allows us to look at their sales, employment, capital expenditure. We can also look at their financial outcomes. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we can also look at how did they behave in terms of their risk indicators, further growth, their financial leverage, etc. And then we use some publicly available bank level data. At that time, I wasn't at RBI. I didn't have access to any internal data. We used the banking statistics report 2 and then some other data that RBI publicly provides. So I have to define a weak firm. We use something very commonsensical. Is the interest coverage ratio of this firm less than 2? So its most recent EBITDA relative to its immediate payments that have to be made on its debt less than 2. So, that means this firm doesn't have too much cash flow relative to its debt needs. We could have also used some operating measure of performance. In hindsight, perhaps that might even be better because it's not mingling the debt and the finance of the firm. Weak banks over this cycle, actually just using public sector banks as weak banks would suffice. You could, however, be a little more micro if you wanted and identify sectors which are weak, such as steel, EPC, infra, textile, and see which banks have high exposures to these sectors. Or you could cheat a little bit and then use ex-post measures based on those stressed assets or NPAs that I showed you, which banks in the end ultimately had the highest losses. We don't have a data set publicly available that gives us which bank is connected to which firm at an individual loan level. But what CMI Prowess does is that using the filings and what the companies disclose in their reports to their shareholders, we can identify which are the banks that are connected to this firm, and they actually list also the top 5 banks who have exposure, because presumably the companies are disclosing that in their reports. So in order to identify whether a firm is connected to a weak bank, depending on the definition of the weak bank, we can come up with some definitions. Is at least one of your banks a public sector bank? Does at least one of the banks in your relationship banks have exposure to a weak sector? And do your banks as a whole have collectively non-performing assets that are above the median non-performing assets in the banking sector? So, there's always some choice here. Typically, researchers take a few measures and see that the conclusions are not heavily robust to any of these things. So let me give a quick overview of channels. I'll just give you the results more or less in graphs. But what we find is that firms that are connected to weak banks, they overinvested in the boom phase of the cycle. And in fact, they had better real outcomes during that boom phase. But they had much weaker outcomes during the down cycle. So these weak firms, the firms that were connected to weak banks basically rode the cycle on an average. Firms with weak corporate balance sheets, so those that were basically, regardless of being connected to their banks, are just weak. So even if you're connected to a healthy bank, you might be a weak firm. These sorts of firms, they just had worse outcomes throughout the sample. But what you find is that the important thing that I wanted to highlight, and then I'll give the magnitudes of what one can, using some counterfactual exercise, attribute to these two channels. So the first channel is the banking channel, which is that the firms that are connected to weak banks in the bust phase, they have much worse outcomes compared to firms that are connected to healthy banks but are otherwise healthy, the firms that are healthy. The firms that have weak corporate balance sheets, that's a pure sort of corporate channel, which is just saying these firms were just weak regardless of the banks they are connected to. And in some ways, I think the magnitudes I'm going to show you will suggest that maybe we have to fix both of these problems. Just fixing the banks is not going to help. Just fixing the firms is not going to help either, because you actually have a transmission going on from the weak banks to the healthier firms of the economy as well. Now, of course, all of these things don't take into account the fact that when you do any of these changes, the whole general equilibrium changes and so on. One needs to do something structural for all that. Okay, so some of these graphs I'm going to show you, I find them quite striking. So let me explain what they are. Both of these graphs are on employment growth, but they are differences. So they are employment growth of weak firms minus the employment growth of strong firms, defined based on this interest coverage ratio being below or above 2. So as you would expect, one would think this ratio should be negative. It's weak firms minus strong firms employment. But you can see that in the left graph, it's sort of flat. It doesn't have a very pronounced boom and bust kind of a pattern that you would attach to differentiating firms based on their own health. What you have in the right graph is the same difference of employment growth, but between firms that are connected to weak banks versus firms that are connected to strong banks. And what you see here is that this is actually more of a boom and bust kind of a pattern. This difference is zero. If anything, it's actually slightly positive during the cycle, which is that firms that are connected to weak banks actually had stronger employment growth during the peak phase of the cycle. But once the cycle turns, this is basically a one-way train just going down. It's just weaker and weaker employment growth for these firms. You can look at CapEx, and you find that CapEx by weak firms versus strong firms, again, the difference should be negative, and you see that. However, if anything, this is actually going in the other direction. The weak firms, when sorted by firm characteristics, are actually growing their CapEx at a relatively faster pace than the healthier firms.